let's talk about let's call it the connection between classic Dungeons and Dragons and video games, right? Um, Basically, look, this is my starting thought. A big reason for the decline, starting in the 1990s, of tabletop D&D, tabletop RPGs in general, even in the midst of the RPG boom, I think play was actually probably declining. I think this is generally accepted. One cause for that was the advancing quality of video games, video RPG game, but RPGs particularly, but other genres too. And this both, I think, meant that lonely fun was easier and funner than ever. It also meant that video games challenged the quality of tabletop games. If a video game was more fun to someone or easier for someone than the guy from a school, the guy from school's D&D game, why bother with the in-person thing when you could play the video game? And what if you didn't know a guy from school? I think growing up, in the 90s, being into video games and RPGs is a lot easier to play a video game than to find people to play RPGs with. One thing that has struck me is how a lot of different genres of video game probably exist as we have them because of the existence of D&D. And of course, in some cases, as with the Elder Scrolls, we know that because the Elder Scrolls was just a D&D campaign world, or maybe was it Rollmaster or something, whatever it was. It was just their game they translated into a video game. And I think in some of these cases, you see the influence of the classic style of D&D play in these subgenres. We'll talk about three subgenres particularly, subgenres, subtypes. I'll discuss them, how they mirror classic D&D concerns, and then maybe reflect on a few lessons for running tabletop games. One thing, by the way, is that classic D&D, just to define it, if you're a regular on the channel, you'll know what we're talking about, but if you're new, you might not. It's a kind of in-house term for some of us in the D&D community, describing a very early type of D&D, emphasizing the adventure game aspect of D&D. You can check the Classic Adventure Game podcast for more on that. You can check some stuff I've got on this channel. I tend to sum it up as having three pillars that distinguish it from other types of D&D, which is that it's world first, player driven, challenge oriented. That stuff that I'm not going to define here further because it'll take more time than is really worth it. But please feel free to check other videos on that. And partly the term may come or is influenced by an article called Six Cultures of Play. Is it Six Cultures? Someone correct me in the comments. So the first type of subtype of game I want to bring up is the thief type. I guess it's describes a lot of games which are called immersive sims. Not all games that are called immersive sims, but lots. I think Thief, Hitman, Dishonored series, that kind of thing. There are some great modern D&D designers, by the way, who have been involved in this. Gabor Lux has famous Thief mods to his name. Anthony Husso worked on the Dishonored series at Arcane Studios. RIP Arcane Studios. Please go and buy some of Tony's adventures to help him out. But let's say a very high-level summary of this subgenre or subtype is that you have a level layout, essentially. This is important, a level layout. You have objectives, and you have you, the player, decides how to achieve these objectives. Are you sneaky or violent? That's a classic one. Is it possible to be violent in the game, or do you have to succeed without being spotted? Do you know games that are a bit like this that we probably think less of as immersive sims, though I sometimes see them in things like Commandos or Desperados as well. Do you utilize the special bypass? Do you go in disguise, perhaps? A high number of variables are being controlled for, given in detail. And this is possible because they're self-contained and relatively small. It may not be actually small, but it's relatively small. And loads of things are being controlled for, and there's loads of interactables. And the more open interactables, the better. So, for instance, I read a discussion about whether or not a particular series was an immersive sim or not, and it was considered that the fact that those games where wood surfaces were always interactable, that was more of an immersive sim. Even if you can't do anything useful with them, the fact they're always interactable as wood makes it more of an immersive sim. But really, I prefer, let's call them thief types, is what's more interesting than specifically that they're immersive sims. And really, this genre is often very much like the old school dungeon. You know, the environment is detailed, it is self-contained. There are or should be choices about how to proceed, how to resolve the problems of the dungeon, rather than a long line of unskippable challenges like, oh, now you fight this boss, now you do this puzzle. Maybe you don't want to do the puzzle, go and do something else. Maybe negotiate, that sort of thing. Maybe you ally with the kobolds, famous example. Maybe you sneak in the chimney, maybe you go in the front door, maybe you'll use a potion of diminution to sneak in as kind of tiny people. The idea is that in the old school dungeon, there are lots of solutions potentially to the problems there, at least more than one usually, and the solution maybe go a different route. And that's similar in the thief type. And I think this is why you see people like Gabor and Tony working in it, because it's one of the most obviously visibly similar things, subgenres of video game. Because if you like going around a dungeon and fighting monsters and sneaking past monsters and negotiating with monsters and solving puzzles, then that kind of more open, highly open to player interaction, highly detailed environment is very like it. And this game emphasizes challenge, it emphasizes skill, intellectual skill, as well as other kinds, and it maps well to, I think, two of those classic D&D pillars: player-driven, challenge-oriented. Player choice matters really a lot, and challenge orientation does. It's actually, ironically, despite being so detailed, in some ways maybe less world first, though that's there too. I won't go into exactly why there, but I think that's probably true. It's player driven, player choice amongst different options, and challenge oriented to come up with the best plan to solve the problems. The second subtype is the open world game. Often, this is also in formal terms, an RPG. Most open world games are RPGs, if just numerically. But it doesn't need to be. Rockstar Games, really obviously, some of the Far Cry games, and there's a few other major examples, they basically eschew the core RPG mechanics of things like leveling up and class systems, or lots of other things, which are kind of the idea of granular choices related to the character, which is maybe archetype of the RPG video game genre. Character, and quest as well. But they retain the open world. There may be quest lines you have to follow, and there may not be many choices within those quest lines, but the point is there's a world that's open and it gives you lots of places you can go. Even the classic platformer series Little Big Adventure, by the way, often has, I'm thinking about LBA 2, but LBA 1 has some of this, but LBA 2 has long sections where you just travel around the world doing what you want, and there are literally no levelable mechanics in the entire game, pretty much. There's no character decisions in the entire game, but it is an open world. The general appeal of the open world game is that there is great variety, openness, freedom for the player, and the way that in the thief type, that is based on interactivity with specific elements on the level. In the open world, it is about the fact that there are so many things and places you can do. There's massive variety. There's not massive variety of choice necessarily. That there usually is. I don't mean that, but rather it's variety of place, and I guess it's about, it's a different kind of immersion being offered. You can ride your horse miles into different landscapes, find all sorts of secrets out in the world. You're like, oh, I stumbled across this weird thing. Has anyone else done this? Meet all kinds of strange people. You can struggle with something but come back later when you have the solution or the right tool. And it's not like the thief type where you have to solve the level. It's more like, okay, I can't do this now, I'll come back. Do you know what? Silly open world example for this, which sometimes there's RPG mechanics, sometimes there aren't, but the Lego games where it's like, oh, I can't do this now, I'll come back later, or I can't work out this platforming section now, I'll come back later. It can be either you literally cannot proceed, or you just need to get better at something. What these games at their best excel at, I think, is the great feeling of vista, opportunity, variety. Red Dead Redemption can take you from the snowy north to Mexico. You can ride on trains, you can race horses, you can fight bandits for bounty, and you've got this big quest line as well. The Witcher 3 has a vast variety of landscapes. You know, it's got France, it's got swamps, it's got Viking places, populated with strange monsters as well from folklore. The Fallout games have all kinds of quirky places. I actually think, and I think this is really sticks in my mind because it's my first Fallout, even though it's for good reason one of the less regarded. Fallout 3 has these things where you're like, oh, I found Oasis, or I'm listening to this radio station. Where does this lady even live? Agatha and her shack. Like, I think those are the experiences I think of for D&D. Not for D&D, for RPGs I'm playing. Where I'm like, ah, yes, this is the open world. This is what it emphasizes, and what it, obviously in D&D we'll most easily recognize this game type in the wilderness, not the dungeon. Though some mega dungeons have this kind of scale of variety, I think. Stonehole, there's different almost settlements, and there's definitely different biomes, many different sub-environments. But mostly we're going to think about the wilderness because of the question of distance, the ability to go to different places, the ability to see different things. Man, maybe we go through the portal again to the other plane and see the people we know there. What the open world, I think, emphasizes most is player choice, sometimes in relation to how to solve challenges, but as much or more often in relation to what a player finds interesting or beautiful or wonder-inducing. There is necessary to a degree of world-first design, because for this to be compelling, the world has to have a separate existence to the player. Not actually, the player is the one playing it in a video game, but what I mean, it literally is prior to the player. The designers have made it, and the same with the tabletop. The DM has made it, and it has to make sense, in a sense, on its own merits for the player to find it compelling, usually at least. Finally, the final type of game, which I really want to say, I think makes me think of classic D&D, is choice and consequence. It seems to draw. The idea here is that it's a game about, or not about, but significantly influenced by the idea that you, the player, make choices, and those choices have important consequences, and they're different based on the different choices you make. It's not in Street Fighter. You just fight a bunch of people and you win. You beat Bison, and you finish your player character quest. But on the other hand, in The Witcher or in the Stanley Parable, if you want to the ultimate choice and consequence game, in one way, these are games where what you do leads to different conclusions, and this, it definitely seems to me to draw in part from tabletop role-playing games, often but not always. Often not always RPGs. As I say, Stanley Parable certainly isn't, but they really turn on that choice and consequence idea. And they are not usually this important. They're not usually in the dungeon type format of the Thief games. Thief type games have choice and consequence, but it's at a very different kind of scale. And I think there are games where there might be a couple of endings, but when we really think about choice and consequence games, we're really talking. So, for instance, you think about Fallout 3 has. Fairly limited endings, and it has a couple of major choices along the way. As an example, that's something which is a bit of a choice and consequence game. It has a couple of things where you can make major decisions one way or another, but usually we think of real hardcore choice and consequence games as ones where loads of stuff, whether it's with the characters you're dealing with, the party members, or whether it's to do with the Dragon Age, as an example, or whether it's to do with the whole world, and Dragon Age certainly does that too, but there's different kinds of choice and consequence game, basically is what I'm saying. Some examples: small to large scale consequences, different levels. Fallout New Vegas, on the other hand, in terms of world altering stuff you can do, there's both a bunch of quests that change stuff, but loads of quests have choice and consequence elements in Fallout New Vegas, more than in 3. And there are 4 game endings, depending on what faction essentially you side with. And that determines maybe who's alive, who's dead, what options you have at the end. The Witcher 1, this is a fun one for me. I think it's an interesting example of someone thinking, how does just a choice come to a consequence? Who do you leave the kid with in chapter 2? Where do you send the kid that is healing up that you've rescued? Well, that's your choice, and you might have a better reason for going for the doctor or the witch, but that's also now going to be your romance option. Sorry for spoiling this over a decade-old game, but this is going to be your romance option going forward. The other lady is angry at you. Kingdom Come Deliverance. There is a bunch of choice and consequence in this game, but I think a really good example of it, just showing the way in which this can shift scale, is, and without actually this important, it can shift scale without becoming just quite the same as a thief type puzzle. Consider the prologue quest. You're meant to get your dad's payment off Kanesh. This is what happens in this game. Your dad's like, oh, go and get the money he's late on his payment for the tools. You can fight Kanesh, you can win, you can fight Kanesh and lose and then continue the quest. You can steal the axe to return to your dad, so he's not out. You can steal stuff from Kanesh to sell, or elsewhere to sell, so you have money to give to your dad. You can recruit your friends to come and beat up Kanesh with you, except then you have to commit a hate crime with them. I'm not joking. I mean, it's not that serious. It's a fecal hate crime. It's moderately serious. There is some skill here, but not really. The skill is, apart from realizing your options, the only real skill is that to beat Kanesh in the fight when you have no skill points takes knowing the game and being quite practiced with the mechanics and being able to read tiny tells quite well. But most of the options don't require much skill at all. There's also, if you're at a later point, if you're running away from the watch, do you get caught or not? That's another one. It's very immersive, it's very replayable, it's very fun and interesting. It shows a world which is, it has the immersive sim element of choices and interactivity, but it's not really about solving the particular box, the puzzle box, which is dungeon type. It's this kind of whole, oh wow, what do I want to do? What would be fun for me? It shows consequences can be localized and still very interesting without becoming a puzzle, because that's not a puzzle quest. And it's fair to say that choice and consequence video games actually draw on lots of RPG tradition, not just or even chiefly necessarily classic D&D. Example, Vampire Masquerade Bloodlines. Do you know what? That's based on Vampire the Masquerade, not D&D, and it's and you'll find that with a lot. In fact, it's important to say this kind of choice and consequence games still often are utilizing, nearly always utilizing, a fairly traditional. There's a story and things are happening. But the gimmick is you can influence it, whereas in Street Fighter there's a story, you're a Street Fighter and you're going to end up fighting M. Bison, Street Fighter 2 anyway. That's a very simple story. And Mario, you're going through the different lands and you're trying to solve the platforms. And there's not very many choices there. But obviously you go all the far end and there's loads of choices and it really can affect the world. But nonetheless, lots of these games, as I say, are not classic in the sense we tend to use in the kind of the discourse. If you listen to the CAG podcast, a lot of them are so-called trad games. Trad and classic sound the same. They're not in this very niche usage. Trad here is more storyline oriented. There's a storyline to play through. There's important pre-written set pieces, that sort of thing. They're partially like interactive fiction, in exactly the way that many video games are like interactive fiction. And the better RPG adventures of this sort, written ones, are going to be detailed on how player choices really do affect the storyline. If they do this, this happens. If they do this, this happens. And that's going to happen throughout, not just at the end of the adventure, but throughout. The less good ones are not very interested in player decisions. They tend to force the story on you. And in this way, you'll often find video games with bigger staff, more resources, more market pressure to be good. They perform better at writing the big interactive stories. It matters more for a video game. RPGs are a small community. There's little money in it, and people are often writing for leisure. And there's no kind of great patronage or fame involved, even if you're writing for leisure. And so the quality is often low, whereas video games often have the resources to put into making that kind of scope successful. But even all that, anyways, is somewhat downstream of classic adventure games. When you see D&D or Traveller, another sci-fi adventure game, in the early to mid 80s, begin to adopt either more intricate storytelling devices or gimmicks in the adventures, or there are big meta plots for the players to experience. Traveller definitely gets to that point. You're seeing an attempt to give players the chance to experience the vast stories and intricate matrices of player decisions that were a big part of early D&D and Traveller campaigns in some of the early designers, the makers, and early adopters, where it was just flowing forth from these exceptionally talented DMs or referees, and so much stuff was happening, and the players had an amazing time. But not every punter on the street picking the book up in the early 80s could do that, and so there was a market for, here's a campaign, and it's not just a campaign in terms of a big dungeon, but here's all these events that will happen. The adventures do the heavy lifting because you might not have the time or the ability to do that. Like the whole political history of Greyhawk, as we have it in the published material, this is Gary Gygax's thing, was shaped by player activity, adventuring, military, diplomatic activity. You find the same when you read the Grey Box for Forgotten Realms, the first edition box set. You see all the major PCs from Ed Greenwood's first two big campaigns in there, kind of, this is what they got to, this is how far they succeeded. And that was something where just the players would be like, I want to do this, can I do this? And Ed Greenwood would be like, because he's created a world, they'd be like, yeah, you can do this. These were much less scripted than the adventures that came often out of them actually later, but certainly later. Much more refereed results than in later published materials as well. They were the arbitration by the human computer, the DM, of the actions by the players, and they led to the world changing. And of course, at that point, it's actually infinitely more fluid than a video game, because everything could keep changing forever, and every input was possible. You think about old text-based games, which really good ones would have a vast variety of inputs. Even, say, adventure games, actually, I'm thinking about point-and-click ones, not text-based adventure games. You can combine every object, but of course, even there, the objects have limited actual connections, and even where there's some funny rejections, and I can't do that because of this crazy thing, that's limited by how much you're willing to write, how many objects there are. Whereas actually the referee can, for that specific way, if they are good, be superior. They can be more flexible. The choice and consequence in modern video games isn't simply a classic adventure game product, but it definitely does link into that tradition. And to state the obvious, it again really hammers home player choice, the player-driven aspect. It's much less connected to challenge orientation. Now, to get certain results in the tabletop context, at least, you may well need skill. But the point is that actually, my example about Kingdom Come Deliverance or Fallout New Vegas, you have to be equally skilled functionally to succeed any of the four endings. It's just your choice which you prefer. Kingdom Come Deliverance, there's very little skill involved in the prologue in that way, but it's compelling and immersive. Sometimes, there might be some choices locked behind skill, beating Kanesh first time in that fight, but usually that's not the case. I think also there is necessarily a certain but lesser degree of world first here. Similar to open world, for the world to make sense and for the decisions to matter, the world has to make sense, it has to have a logic. But that's probably, as I say, it's interesting, by the way, we're picking up here what video games really emphasize across these subgenres, whether it's about the kind of dungeon level puzzle box of the Thief type games, or the expansive open world, or the loads of stuff you do will have consequences, and it matters what you decide. Choice and consequence. Player driven is a pillar which video games have, I think, basically done very well with. They've really pushed into, and you could say, well, that's obvious because it's a game, but then isn't that interesting as a lesson for the tabletop? Is that something people like in games is being able to decide stuff. Now, you could say not every game is like that. It's true. Like I say, but even Mario has like secret bits, or you can go and do something else. But the point is, yes, I grant the point. Not every video game that people like is like that. Street Fighter, the choices are how you punch something to death. I think, it's good to recognise that. But nonetheless, most games, even Street Fighter has choices, most games have a good amount of choice for the player. It might be about what kind of equipment they can have. It might be about their favourite weapon, even in shooters. I'm thinking about my experience with Call of Duty over the years, when I played regularly, and that you had certain choices of weapon that you definitely prefer, and certainly when you start to play RPGs or kind of big actiony games, there tends to be more choice or more scope, and players like that, and they like that to be good. And that's something which is interesting that does not come across really strongly from lots of published role-playing game adventures, including even ones that are nominally classic or within the general old school movement. And that certainly seems like a really important thing to pick up, that players like making decisions, and a good game, and it depends what you think is the most important thing about D&D for you, but a good game is often should have a lot of things the players can do, lots of levers they can put on, lots of situations they can exploit, and perhaps lots of places they can go, and lots of things where the thing they decide has genuinely important downstream consequences. And I actually keep thinking of new games actually for that issue of consequence, because that's something which video games palpably do better than most written adventures, probably more than the other two actually, but choice and consequence is something that video games do better than most written adventures. So that's one lesson: is player choice matters a lot. It actually turns out to be the thing that I'm drawing out most from this. I think the other thing is knowing what the advantages of being a DM are, of it being tabletop. A large language model can provide a lot of information. You can DM a game with an LLM, but what can the DM do that the LLM will struggle with, because of the issue of selection, essentially to do with discrimination. But certainly the video game cannot do. Well, look, you can be infinitely flexible about consequence. You can be infinitely flexible about interactivity. The best immersive sim is not as interactive as a DM can be. The best choice and consequence game cannot map as many consequences as a DM can. Because you are able to update everything in real time, you're able to reprogram the game in real time. You can constantly just reflect on what you can do. Now, the point is, you should be learning from the fact that video games do this well, and that often tabletop games do it badly. But you should be thinking that you can't compete with but it's also worth saying you cannot compete with all the things that video games do well. What I mean is, you can't do the voice acting, you can't do the graphics. Unless you're a really good painter, you can't make it immersive in the same ways as the video game. What's going to be unique are things like the social aspect and the infinite interactivity. And I think my own experience of games I've told the story before, I think, on the channel, of a friend saying that they wanted some information in the Forgotten Realms, and they're like, Candlekeep exists, maybe I should just ask if we can go there. And he felt confident. He's like, the game is open and interactive. I said, can we go there? And I said, yeah, it's going to be dangerous. The sea travel is dangerous. Lots of things to do. And so they're like, okay, but we'll do that. And that proved to them the world was open. If I'd said, no, actually, it's just too difficult. There's no ships. It's too difficult this time of year. There's no teleports. That's something where the video game has to say, look, you can't go everywhere because we don't have the money, as much as we have more money and time and resource than the DM in many ways. We also don't have infinite time. And we can't infinitely iterate. Whereas the DM can say, yeah, let's work it out. They might need to get some resources, they might need to take some time to prep, but the point is, the game can develop in new directions constantly, whereas the video game can't. So those are the two real takeaways from my thoughts about this. And there are probably more intelligent ones you can add in the comments, but I think those two, that all kinds of player choice matter a lot to players in most games they play, especially in role-playing game adjacent video games. And two, you've got to know what you can't do at the tabletop the video games are better at, and not attempt to compete with it, whilst also knowing what you can do better than a video game, even though you are a poor and humble DM with no money. Anyway, tell me your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next time.